He built a life where everything was perfect. A home made of glass where nothing could hide. But behind the flawless walls, one truth shattered it all. Daniel Mercer was a man who believed in order, in loyalty, in love. But when his wife crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, everything he thought he knew fell apart. A betrayal born from lies. An adultery that would awaken something cold and calculating. Now, Daniel doesn't just want answers, he wants control. Step by step, move by move, he turns the perfect life they built together into the ultimate trap. But as the house of glass closes in, no one will be safe from the consequences of betrayal. If you think you know where this story is going, think again. Stay tuned if you want to know how the story ends, and don't forget to subscribe.
The house stood on a quiet hill, alone, immaculate, its walls of glass gleaming under the cold, gray sky. From a distance, it seemed weightless, like a sculpture suspended in air, but inside, the weight of silence pressed against the transparent walls. It was a silence Daniel Mercer had grown familiar with over the last year. It was a silence not of peace, but of distance. Not an absence of sound, but an absence of truth. He sat in his study, hands folded in his lap, the clean lines of the desk before him mirroring the symmetry of the house he had designed. It had been his masterpiece, a home of light and openness, of transparency and balance. Now it felt exposed, vulnerable. Everything did. Daniel stared at the monitor in front of him. Security footage from the past week played in muted tones. Vivian stepping out of her car, Vivian taking calls on the terrace, Vivian leaving the house when she said she was working late. There were timestamps he couldn't ignore. Places she had been where she hadn't said she would go. He had not wanted to see it at first. For months, he had told himself he was imagining things. Vivian was simply tired. She was overworked. She was restless. He had designed a life of comfort for them both, but perhaps too much comfort bred boredom. It wasn't his fault, he told himself. She had everything here. Everything anyone could want. But people like Vivian, they wanted more. And what they wanted could not be contained by glass walls, no matter how beautiful. The sound of high heels on polished concrete echoed down the hall. Daniel closed the monitor window with a tap of his finger and straightened his tie. He always dressed well, even at home. He believed in appearances, in maintaining the dignity of structure, even when the foundation had begun to crack. Vivian appeared in the doorway, framed like a figure in a gallery. She wore black. Not morning black, but elegant, deliberate. Her dark hair was pinned back, loose strands framing a face that was beautiful in a way that had once disarmed him. Now he studied her the way he studied his architectural models. Every line, every angle.
"I'm going out," she said. "No greeting. No explanation."
He nodded. Of course. Her gaze lingered on him for a moment, cautious. She had learned to be cautious.
He had been careful about that.
Nothing overt.
No questions. No scenes.
Only the weight of unspoken things. "Don't wait up," she added. "I never do," he replied quietly. And then she was gone, her reflection retreating in the polished surfaces of glass and steel. Daniel listened to the front door open and close. He waited until the sound of the car faded down the private drive. Then he reached for his phone. The number was new. A contact added 2 weeks ago under the name Ethan Caldwell. A man he had met through a quiet referral. Discreet. Effective. The kind of man who asked no unnecessary questions and left no trail behind him. Daniel pressed the call button. "Yeah," came the answer after 2 rings.
"She just left," Daniel said.
"You know what to do." There was a brief pause. Understood. Daniel ended the call and returned the phone to his pocket. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. His hands were steady. They had always been steady. It was how he had built his career, precision, discipline. He had made a name for himself designing perfect homes for people who wanted their lives to look flawless. Now, he would use those same principles for something else entirely. He rose from the chair and walked to the window. Below, the city spread out in muted lights, a reflection of his own carefully ordered world. But beneath those lights were shadows. And in those shadows, people did things they thought no one could see. But he could see. He had always been good at seeing things others missed. Vivian's car moved smoothly through the narrow streets downtown, past boutiques and cafes that glittered like promises.
She didn't look at them.
Her attention was fixed on the road ahead, her expression neutral. But inside, her pulse raced. She parked 2 blocks from the hotel. Not because she was being cautious, at least that's what she told herself, but because she liked the walk. The anticipation. Julian was already there, waiting for her in the penthouse suite. He always made sure it was the best room. He always made sure she felt wanted. Needed. She entered through the side door, past staff who had learned not to ask questions. Her heels made no sound on the thick carpets. The elevator took her up in silence, her reflection staring back at her from its mirrored walls. When the door opened, he was there. Smiling. Always smiling. He kissed her like a secret, his hands sliding over her as if he already knew the answer to every question. And for a little while, she forgot about Daniel, about the house of glass, about the feeling of being watched. Ethan Caldwell watched from his car, camera in hand. He didn't need to get close. The lens did the work for him. He captured the way she looked up at the building, the way her expression softened when Julian opened the door. He documented the way they touched in the hallway before the door closed behind them. He sat back and lit a cigarette, though he told himself every day he should quit. It was a dirty habit, but he liked dirty habits. They kept him grounded, reminded him of who he was before he traded a badge for a camera and a paycheck from men like Daniel Mercer. He texted Daniel 2 photos. No commentary. No need. The reply came almost instantly. Understood.
Keep going.
Ethan took another drag from his cigarette and wondered, not for the first time, why men like Daniel Mercer never got their own hands dirty. But then he wasn't paid to wonder. He was paid to watch. And so he watched. The next morning, Daniel made eggs. Vivian liked them soft, with chives and goat cheese. He set the plate down in front of her as she came into the kitchen, freshly showered, smelling faintly of lavender. She looked at the food, then at him. "You're in a good mood." "I like making breakfast," he said. She sat.
Ate.
He watched her for a moment, then picked up his coffee and turned toward the window. The sky was clearing. Light spilled over the hills and into their glass home. He imagined for a moment it might burn away, everything false. But of course, it never did. "You're working late again tonight?" he asked, casual. She hesitated.
Yes.
"We have a new exhibit opening soon. Long hours." He smiled faintly. "Of course." Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it quickly, then silenced it without answering. He didn't ask who it was. He didn't have to. He finished his coffee and set the cup in the sink. "Don't work too hard," he said as he picked up his briefcase. "You'll wear yourself out." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'll manage." Daniel nodded and left. His car pulled away from the house. Vivian watched him go, then turned back to her phone. It was Julian. A simple message. Tonight. Same place. And like that, she was somewhere else again. Someone else. Ethan met Daniel in a quiet cafe 2 nights later. They sat in a corner booth, the kind of place where no one asked your name. "These are from last night," Ethan said, sliding a folder across the table. Daniel opened it. Photos. Time-stamped. Vivian in Julian's arms. Vivian in Julian's bed. Clear, undeniable. "She's not careful," Ethan added. "He isn't either. Could be leverage if you want it." Daniel studied the images. "Not yet." Ethan shrugged. "You're the boss." Daniel closed the folder and set it aside. His fingers tapped against the table in a slow, steady rhythm. He was already thinking 10 moves ahead. "What's your next step?" Ethan asked. Daniel looked at him, and for a moment, Ethan saw something cold behind those calm eyes. "Let them think they're winning," Daniel said quietly. "Then take everything." Ethan nodded. He had seen revenge before. But there was something different about Daniel Mercer. Something precise. Surgical. Ethan left first. Daniel stayed behind, staring at his untouched coffee. Outside, the rain had started again, streaking the glass with fine, silver lines. It blurred the world beyond, but Daniel didn't need to see it clearly. He already knew how it would end. And it would end on his terms. Vivian stood in front of the gallery window, staring out as if she were waiting for someone. Outside, the streetlights flickered on in the early dusk, washing the cobblestones in pale gold. The reflection staring back at her in the glass was immaculate, controlled, her makeup flawless, her dark hair swept into a chignon, her expression poised. But behind the mask, she was restless. The gallery had emptied out hours ago. The staff had finished setting up for the upcoming exhibit and gone home. She had insisted on staying late, telling them she had details to review.
It was easier that way.
She didn't have to lie to their faces. Only to herself. Her phone buzzed on the pedestal beside her. She glanced at it.
Julian.
Room's ready. Waiting for you. Vivian exhaled slowly, then picked up her coat. She walked through the empty gallery, past paintings that had once made her feel something, wonder, excitement, inspiration. Now they felt flat, like everything else. She locked the doors behind her and stepped out into the evening air. Her heels clicked against the stone. She told herself this wasn't wrong, that she was taking control of her life, choosing passion over complacency, that Daniel had become distant long before she had, that the life he had built for them was sterile, glass walls and empty spaces. But deep down, she knew none of that was true. Daniel watched the footage on his tablet, fingers steepled beneath his chin. He was alone in his studio, a vast space of concrete and steel, where he worked on his designs. Blueprints were spread out across the drafting table, but his focus wasn't on them now. It was on Vivian. He tracked her as she left the gallery, as she crossed the street toward her car. The GPS tracker he'd installed in her vehicle fed him real-time updates. He knew where she was before she even got there. A message blinked at the bottom of the screen. Ethan. Following. Same place as last time. Daniel typed back, stay with her. He set the tablet down and walked to the window. The city spread out below him in a blur of lights. He could almost feel the pulse of it, fast, erratic, like a heartbeat on the edge of panic. Or anticipation. He had designed buildings to withstand earthquakes. He knew the signs when a structure was ready to collapse. Vivian's life was no different. A fault line beneath the surface.
Pressure building.
And he would be the one to bring it down. Ethan sat in his car, watching through his telephoto lens as Vivian entered the hotel. It was an expensive place. Discreet. The kind of place where men like Julian Ward did their dirty business. Ethan had followed Ward before, divorce cases mostly. He was arrogant and reckless, not the kind of man who covered his tracks well. But Vivian, she surprised him. She wasn't stupid. She was careful enough. But there was something else in her. Desperation. As if she were running from something even she couldn't name. He snapped a few photos as she stepped into the elevator, then lowered the camera. He wasn't paid to feel sorry for her. He wasn't paid to think. But something about the way she carried herself, like a woman already haunted by the consequences, stuck with him. He texted Daniel the latest pictures, then leaned back and waited. Julian poured Vivian a drink as she slipped her coat from her shoulders. He handed her the glass with that easy, confident smile she had once found charming. Now it was something else, habitual, automatic. She wondered if he even knew he did it anymore. You're tense, he said, watching her over the rim of his glass. I'm fine, she lied. He tilted his head, studying her. You're not worried about your husband, are you? Daniel doesn't seem the type to get his hands dirty. Vivian took a sip of her drink. You don't know him. Julian chuckled. I know men like him. Obsessed with appearances. They'd rather keep up the facade than confront the truth. She didn't answer. Because he wasn't wrong. That's how it had been for years. Daniel, building his perfect world. Vivian trying not to shatter it. Until she did. Julian moved closer, his hand at the small of her back. Forget him, he whispered. You're here now. And she let him kiss her. She let herself forget for a little while. Daniel sat in the dim glow of his studio, his mind already turning over possibilities. He had gathered everything he needed. Photos, videos, phone records. He knew about the prepaid phone Vivian used. He knew about the withdrawals from their joint account, small enough not to raise suspicion, but frequent enough to support her meetings with Julian. And he knew about Julian's marriage. Knew about the corporate law firm that prided itself on integrity while its senior partner slept with another man's wife in hotel rooms he paid for with laundered bonuses. Daniel had never been reckless. He would not start now. The first phase was always observation. The second was preparation. He opened a drawer and removed a slim, black folder. Inside was a legal document already prepared. A transfer of assets. If Vivian signed it, she would relinquish any claim to their shared properties, their accounts, everything they had built together. And if she refused, well, Daniel had thought of that too. His phone vibrated. Another message from Ethan. She's leaving. On her way back. Daniel closed the folder. Time to act. Vivian returned home just after midnight. She parked in the garage as always.
Quiet.
Routine. She entered through the side door, heels silent on the marble floors. The house was dark, but she didn't turn on the lights. She was good at navigating the dark now. She passed the kitchen. The faint scent of coffee hung in the air. She wondered if Daniel was still awake. Part of her hoped he was. She climbed the stairs, her footsteps measured. The master bedroom door was open. The bed was empty. She stepped inside, slowly removing her earrings, placing them on the dresser. You're late. The voice was calm, steady, but it froze her in place. Daniel stood by the window, his silhouette framed against the night beyond. His reflection shimmered faintly in the glass. I told you I was working late, she said, keeping her voice even. He nodded.
Yes.
At the gallery. She turned toward him. It's true. I'm sure it is, he said. Most of the time. She felt a flicker of fear then, deep in her stomach. But she forced herself to smile. Why are you standing there in the dark? He didn't answer right away. He stepped forward instead, stopping a few feet away from her. Close enough that she could see his eyes. Cold. Empty. Do you love him? He asked quietly. The question hit her like a blow. She tried to laugh, but the sound died in her throat. Who? Daniel's head tilted slightly. Don't insult me. She swallowed. It's complicated. He nodded again. I thought it might be. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel turned and walked toward the door. Before he left, he said, breakfast at 7. We have things to discuss. And then he was gone. Vivian stood there for a long time, staring at the empty doorway. Her heart pounded in her chest. The walls of glass around her suddenly felt suffocating. The next morning, Daniel made breakfast. Eggs, soft. Toast, lightly browned. Fresh coffee. Vivian sat across from him at the long dining table, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup she didn't drink from. He slid a folder toward her. These are divorce papers. Her breath caught. Daniel. He held up a hand. I'm not filing them. Not yet. She looked at him, searching for something in his expression. There was nothing there. No anger. No betrayal. Just cold efficiency. I'm giving you a choice, he said. Sign over your claim to the house, the accounts, everything. You walk away clean. She stared at the folder. And if I don't? His gaze didn't waver. Then I take everything. And I destroy him in the process.
Julian, she said.
Daniel didn't nod. He didn't have to. She shook her head. You can't. I can, he said. I have the evidence. Affairs. Financial misconduct.
Bribery.
His partners will drop him in an instant. His wife will crucify him. And you'll be collateral damage. Vivian's hands trembled as she opened the folder. The documents were there. Legal. Binding. I don't want to do this, Daniel said softly. But you left me no choice. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them away. She picked up the pen he had placed beside her plate. I need time, she said. You have 24 hours, he replied. And then he stood, gathered his things, and left for work as if it were any other day. Vivian sat at the table long after he was gone, staring at the papers. The house around her was silent. Too silent. She stood, walking through the rooms as if seeing them for the first time. Every surface gleamed. Every line was perfect. But now, she noticed things she hadn't before. The cameras. The subtle hum of electronics behind the walls. The feeling of being watched. She had lived in a house of glass. And now she realized it wasn't a home. It was a cage. And Daniel had the key. The hours passed slowly. Vivian wandered through the house like a ghost. She had no destination, only motion, a futile attempt to outrun the weight of what had just happened. The folder sat on the dining table where Daniel had left it, closed neatly as though it were nothing more than a stack of design proposals, waiting for her signature. But it wasn't paperwork. It was an ultimatum. Outside, the glass walls of their home reflected the soft light of afternoon, giving the illusion of warmth. Inside, everything felt colder than it ever had. Vivian stood at the edge of the living room, where one entire wall opened out onto the view of the city below. She used to love standing there, sipping her morning coffee as dawn broke over the skyline. It had made her feel powerful once. Limitless. Now she realized it made her visible.
Exposed.
Daniel had designed it that way. Open floor plans, transparent walls, no room for secrets. He had created a house that watched you at all times, even when you didn't realize it. Especially when you didn't realize it. She sat on the sofa and stared out at the world. Everything they had built was beautiful. Cold, calculated, and beautiful. It wasn't real, not anymore. Maybe it never had been. Her phone buzzed. She startled, as though the sound had cracked glass. She snatched it up, relieved to see Julian's name on the screen. What happened? You're not answering. She hesitated for a moment before replying. We need to talk.
Soon.
A second later, another message came through. I'll come to you. 20 minutes. She typed back quickly.
No.
Not here.
Meet me at the gallery.
He agreed. She didn't have time to think about what she would tell him. All she knew was that Daniel was serious. The folder on the table had made that clear. The quiet, precise way he had presented it made it worse than if he had shouted. Daniel had never raised his voice. Not once. But his silence could suffocate. Vivian grabbed her coat and keys, casting one last glance at the cameras she now noticed perched high in the corners of the room. She wasn't sure if they were recording. She wasn't sure if she cared. She drove to the gallery with her hands tight on the wheel. The streets blurred past her. Her mind raced faster than the car. What had Daniel done? How far had he gone? She had always believed, deep down, that she was the one in control. She thought he would look away, the way he always had. She thought she could have this part of her life, separate from the one they shared. She was wrong. Julian was already there when she arrived. He stood by the front entrance, wearing sunglasses despite the late hour. He looked like he belonged on a billboard, not outside an art gallery. But that was Julian, always on display. He smiled when he saw her, but it faded quickly. He saw her expression and knew this wasn't going to be a good meeting. They stepped inside. She locked the door behind them and pulled the curtains shut. The gallery was quiet, the kind of quiet that made her ears ring. Julian followed her into the center of the space, between two tall sculptures of twisted metal. They made her think of cages. Tell me, he said. She turned to face him. Daniel knows. Julian exhaled through his nose, a half laugh. Of course he knows. So what? She shook her head. It's not what you think. He's got everything. Photos, videos, documents. He looked unconcerned. That's what divorce lawyers are for. You don't understand, she snapped. He doesn't want a divorce. He wants to take everything. From both of us. Julian took off his sunglasses slowly. Both of us. Vivian nodded. He has evidence against you. Financial stuff. Things you did at the firm. Julian's jaw tightened. His confidence slipped for a moment, just long enough for her to see it.
How?
I don't know.
He didn't say.
But he has it. Julian paced a slow circle around her. He's bluffing. He's not, she said. You didn't see him. He's planned this. For months, maybe longer. Julian stopped pacing. Then we go on the offensive. Vivian frowned. What do you mean? We get ahead of it. We control the narrative. You tell your side before he can. We make him look like the controlling husband with a vendetta. She shook her head again. No one will believe that. Not after what he has. Julian's expression darkened. Then we get rid of what he has. Vivian felt her stomach twist. You want to break into his office? Why not? You know the house. You know where he keeps things. He keeps them in his head, she said. And on backups I'll never find. You don't know Daniel. He's not impulsive. He's not careless. Julian crossed his arms. Then we find another way. She looked away. There's no other way. He gave me a choice. Sign everything over. Or he burns us both. Julian was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached for her hand. We run. Vivian stared at him. Run where?
Anywhere, he said.
We have money. You have access to accounts. We disappear before he can do anything. She pulled her hand back. He'll find us. You're overestimating him. No, she whispered. You're underestimating him. Daniel watched them from his studio. The camera feeds were grainy, black and white, but clear enough. He saw them standing close in the gallery. Saw Julian's hand on Vivian's. He watched them talk, their expressions tense. He couldn't hear them, but he didn't need to. He had already anticipated this move. He picked up his phone and called Ethan.
They're meeting, Daniel said.
They'll be leaving soon. Ethan grunted. Want me to follow? No, Daniel said. I want you to deliver the file. Ethan paused. You sure? Do it, Daniel said. He ended the call and leaned back in his chair. His reflection stared back at him from the dark window. He didn't smile. There was nothing to smile about. This wasn't revenge. This was justice. Vivian returned home late. Julian had insisted on staying behind to arrange details. He was talking about flights, fake passports, offshore accounts. He was good at making things sound easy. But Vivian knew better. She knew what it meant to run. To leave behind everything familiar. She wasn't ready. She wasn't sure she ever would be. The house was dark when she stepped inside. Daniel wasn't home. She stood in the entryway for a long time listening. There was only silence. She went to the bedroom and found a note on her pillow. 7 a.m. We finished this. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. She lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling. She thought of the times she and Daniel had laid here together, early in their marriage, talking about their future.
She thought of how safe she had felt then.
Now the safety was gone. And in its place was something she didn't have a name for. Ethan met Julian in the parking lot of his office building the next morning. He wore a plain black jacket and jeans. He looked like anyone, and that was the point. Julian recognized him immediately. He had a predator's instinct for danger. Who are you? Julian demanded. Ethan handed him an envelope. A friend of Daniel's. Julian opened it. Inside were copies of bank transfers, falsified contracts, and photographs. Evidence of things he thought were buried. You give this to the cops? Julian asked, his voice tight.
Not yet, Ethan said.
Daniel wanted you to see it first. Julian's hand clenched around the papers. What does he want? You already know, Ethan said. He wants everything. Julian laughed, bitter and low. He'll ruin her too. That's the point, Ethan said. Julian stared at him. You get paid for this? I get paid not to care, Ethan said. And then he walked away. At 7 a.m., Daniel sat at the dining table, waiting. Vivian appeared in the doorway. She looked exhausted.
Pale.
There was no makeup to hide it today. She sat across from him. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Daniel slid the folder toward her again. The pen lay on top. You said you loved me once, Vivian whispered.
I did, Daniel said.
And I meant it. Do you still? He was quiet.
No.
She picked up the pen. Her hand shook as she signed each page. When she was done, she closed the folder and pushed it back toward him. Daniel took it without a word. What happens now? She asked. You leave, he said. That's it. For you, he said. She stood slowly. Where do I go? That's not my concern. Vivian walked to the door, her suitcase already packed. She looked back once. Daniel didn't move. He watched her leave, the glass walls of the house reflecting her retreat. When the door clicked shut, he closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them, and the house was silent once more. Vivian didn't look back as she drove away. She didn't see Daniel watching from the window. She didn't see the cameras following her. But Daniel saw everything. And he always would. The silence after Vivian left was different from all the silences before. It wasn't the quiet tension of a house balancing on the edge of collapse. It was a deeper, more absolute stillness. The kind of silence that came after the storm, when the damage had already been done and nothing more needed to be said. Daniel stood at the window, watching until the faint silhouette of her car disappeared around the bend in the private road. He stayed there for a long time, unmoving, his hands folded neatly behind his back. He imagined the sound of her suitcase wheels clicking against the pavement as she dragged it to the car. He imagined her looking back one last time. But she hadn't. He knew that without seeing it. There was nothing left for her to look back on. Later that day, Daniel entered his study with a sense of purpose that felt almost ritualistic. The room was clean, spare, and symmetrical. His drafting table stood in the center, a stark rectangle of glass and brushed steel. To the right, the tall cabinets where he stored his plans. To the left, a single chair facing a wall of screens. He sat in the chair and woke the monitors. Security footage sprang to life in clean grids. Views of the property, the roads, the house interior, the gallery. And now, the camera feed from Julian Ward's office. Daniel had planned it all methodically. Every camera, every lens. He had hired Ethan not only to follow, but to plant devices. And Ethan had done it well. There was no angle of Julian's life that wasn't recorded now. Daniel watched as Julian sat at his desk, head bowed, his phone pressed to his ear. The sound was tinny through the speakers, but clear. "What do you mean they're freezing the accounts?" Julian's voice was sharp, demanding. The answer wasn't audible, but Daniel didn't need to hear it. He knew the tone of panic when he saw it. "They can't do that without notice," Julian snapped. "I want that money moved now." Daniel tapped a key. Another window opened. A bank terminal screen showing Julian's accounts. Transfers suspended. Assets seized. The quiet legal machinery Daniel had put in motion was grinding forward, as inevitable and unrelenting as gravity. He leaned back, watching. Julian stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. Paper slid from his desk as he swept an arm across it in fury. His face was red with rage, his movements erratic. The predator reduced to prey. Daniel watched for a few more moments, then muted the feed. He had seen enough. He turned to his desk and picked up his phone. A message from Ethan was waiting. "It's done. Everything's public." Daniel set the phone down, his fingertips resting lightly against its sleek surface. The world was already watching now. The media would be fed the story, an anonymous tip, neatly packaged files. The press would pick at Julian's life until there was nothing left but bones. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment and let himself feel, not satisfaction. That wasn't what this was. This was balance. The scales righted. Vivian sat alone in a small cafe on the far side of the city, her hands wrapped tightly around a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. She stared out the window, but she wasn't seeing anything. Her phone vibrated once on the table. She hesitated before picking it up. A single message from Julian. He did it. "It's over." She closed her eyes. For a long time, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she typed back. "Where are you?" The reply came quickly.
Gone.
"You should do the same." She let the phone slip from her fingers onto the table. The thought of leaving, of disappearing into another life, had once seemed like an escape. Now it felt like a sentence. She thought of Daniel again. Of his quiet precision, his patience, his certainty. He had dismantled her life with the same care he took designing his buildings. No cracks left unrepaired. No room for chaos. She picked up her phone and dialed. She didn't know what she was hoping for. Maybe he wouldn't answer. Maybe he would. But after 3 rings, his voice came through.
Calm.
Measured. "Vivian." She didn't speak right away. She let the silence hang there between them. "You win," she said finally. There was no gloating in his tone. Only quiet inevitability. This was never about winning. "What was it about?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know.
Finishing, he said.
She closed her eyes again. "What happens now?" There was a pause. Then, "That's up to you." She hung up. Daniel ended the call and stood slowly. His movements were deliberate, controlled. He crossed the studio and opened the tall glass door that led out to the terrace. The city stretched below him, vast and indifferent. Cars moved like insects along the winding roads. Lights blinked in high-rises and apartment towers. He thought about all the lives unfolding in those spaces, flawed, complicated, tangled. His life was no different, he supposed. Only now it was simpler. Cleaner. He returned inside and locked the terrace door behind him. Julian Ward's fall was spectacular. By the next morning, news sites were flooded with headlines. Corporate fraud, bribery, affairs. His face, once polished and controlled, was now splashed across every major outlet, pale and drawn. His partners announced an emergency board meeting. His wife filed for divorce, citing adultery and financial deception. Daniel read the headlines dispassionately, scrolling through articles on his phone as he sipped black coffee. He didn't linger. The outcome had been inevitable from the moment Julian thought he could play his game and win. Ethan called later that afternoon. "You see the news?" Ethan asked, though he already knew the answer.
Yes, Daniel said.
"Anything else you need me to do?" Ethan's tone was casual, but there was an undercurrent of curiosity beneath it. "No," Daniel replied. "It's over." A pause. "You don't sound relieved," Ethan said. Daniel said nothing for a moment. Then, "I didn't do this for relief." Ethan sighed.
"Well,
"If you ever need a guy again." Daniel ended the call before he could finish. Vivian sat on a park bench as the afternoon's sun bled into evening. Her suitcase sat at her feet, scuffed from travel. She hadn't gone far. Part of her knew there was nowhere to go. Her phone buzzed with a call. Unknown number. She answered without thinking. Vivian. It was Daniel. She recognized his voice immediately. "I'm at the house," he said. "You should come back." She stared out across the empty park. "Why?" "There's something here for you," he said. "I signed everything away," she said flatly. "This isn't about money." Silence hung between them again. She thought about the house, the glass walls, the smooth concrete, the cold perfection of it all. She thought about how it had felt to live there, watched but safe. She stood and picked up her suitcase. "I'll be there soon." The house looked the same.
Of course it did.
Daniel wouldn't have changed anything. The same clean lines. The same pristine glass. But something was different. Vivian stepped inside and found him waiting in the living room. He stood near the window, his hands at his sides. "I'm not staying," she said before he could speak. He nodded. "I didn't ask you to." She dropped her suitcase just inside the door and walked toward him slowly. "Why did you call me back?" Daniel turned slightly and gestured to the table behind him. A single envelope lay there. She picked it up and opened it. Inside was a set of photographs. Not of her. Not of Julian. Of herself. Alone. Sitting in cafes. Walking along streets. Sitting in the gallery late at night. Moments she hadn't known anyone was watching. "You followed me before the affair," she said softly. Daniel's gaze didn't change. "I saw you long before you thought you were lost." "Why?" she asked.
"Because I knew," he said.
Even then. Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them away. "And this is your final punishment?"
"No," Daniel said.
"This is your release." She stared at the photographs again. She didn't understand. "I'm not holding anything over you anymore," he said. "You're free." She laughed once, bitter. "You call this freedom? You can leave," he said. "You already did. But you came back. I thought you should know what that means." She set the photographs down carefully. "And what does it mean?" Daniel didn't answer. He turned away from her and walked toward the window again. Vivian picked up her suitcase. She walked to the door. She hesitated once, but she didn't look back. When she stepped outside, the air felt cold, but clear. Daniel watched her leave again. This time there was no satisfaction. There was no feeling at all. He closed his eyes and stood in the silence of the house. His house. The house of glass. It had always been designed to be transparent, to let light in. But now he realized it was a prison made of windows. And he had locked himself inside. The days that followed Vivian's departure passed quietly. Too quietly, even for Daniel Mercer. The house, his masterpiece of steel, glass, and light, remained immaculate. The floor was polished to a gleam, the walls transparent and clean. There was no dust, no clutter, no signs of anyone having lived there at all. Only silence. He woke at 5 every morning, as he always had. He made his coffee the same way. He walked the hallways and checked the cameras, though there was no longer any reason to. The feeds were empty now. Vivian was gone. Julian Ward had been destroyed. There were no more threats to watch for. No more movements to track. No one left to study. And yet, Daniel still found himself standing at the windows, watching, waiting. For what, he didn't know. Ethan Caldwell hadn't expected a call from Daniel. He hadn't heard from him in weeks. Most clients didn't check in after a job was done, and he preferred it that way. Loose ends always complicated things. But Daniel was different. He wasn't the type to leave anything unfinished. The message had been simple. Come to the house. Ethan drove up the long, winding road that led to Daniel's home. It sat on its hilltop like a crown of glass, gleaming in the sunlight.
Perfect.
Imposing.
Hollow.
He parked his car in the circular drive and approached the front door. It opened before he could knock. Daniel stood there, dressed neatly in a dark shirt and slacks, his expression unreadable. "Ethan," Daniel said by way of greeting. "Daniel," Ethan replied. They stood there for a moment before Daniel gestured for him to enter. The house was just as Ethan remembered it. Every line exact. Every surface pristine. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like an exhibit. They sat in the living room, facing each other across a low table. Ethan's eyes wandered to the walls, the windows. He could almost feel them watching him. "I wanted to thank you," Daniel said after a long silence. Ethan shrugged. "You paid me." Daniel nodded. "And I appreciate your discretion." Ethan didn't answer. He wasn't in the habit of reassuring clients. But Daniel's tone was different now. Not the cold precision of before. There was something else under the surface. A question, maybe. Or doubt. "You got what you wanted," Ethan said. "Both of them. Gone." Daniel looked down at his hands. They were still, resting on his knees. "Did I?" he asked softly. Ethan said nothing. He had seen this before. Men who planned their revenge down to the finest detail, who executed it flawlessly. And when it was over, they found themselves standing in the ruins, wondering why they still felt hollow. "You never told me why you married her," Ethan said suddenly. Daniel glanced up. His expression didn't change. "Because I thought she would understand me." "And she didn't?" "No," Daniel said quietly. "And I didn't understand her either." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "So, what now?" Daniel was silent for a long time before he answered. "I keep building," he said. "It's all I've ever done." Ethan nodded slowly. "Good luck with that." Daniel didn't reply. He simply stood, walking to the window. Ethan took that as his cue to leave. At the door, Ethan glanced back once. Daniel stood there, still as a statue, framed by glass. A man who had designed his life to be perfect, only to find himself trapped inside it. Ethan left without another word. Vivian's new apartment was small. Nothing like the house on the hill. It was a one-bedroom in a part of the city she used to avoid. The floors creaked. The paint peeled. But the windows were solid wood frames, not glass walls. No one could see inside unless she let them. She worked at a smaller gallery now. One that didn't attract attention. She kept her head down. She saved her money. She spoke to no one unless she had to. At night, she lay awake and thought of the house. She thought of the man she had married and the man he had become. She wondered if they had ever really known each other at all. One afternoon, months later, a letter arrived. There was no return address, but she knew the handwriting. Inside was a single page. "There is nothing left to take." She stared at it for a long time before folding it neatly and placing it in the drawer beside her bed. She didn't cry. She didn't feel much of anything. But for the first time in a long time, she slept through the night. Julian Ward was gone. Rumor had it he fled the country under an assumed name. Others said he was living in some no-name town, working as a consultant for a company that didn't care about his past. No one knew for sure. No one really cared anymore. His fall had been swift and complete. His assets seized. His wife remarried. His name erased from the firm's records. He was a ghost, and Daniel had made him that way. Daniel continued working. New clients came. He designed homes for them. Beautiful homes. Flawless designs. Glass and steel. Clean lines. Open spaces. He smiled when he had to. He attended charity events. He shook hands. But at night, he returned to the house on the hill. He walked its empty rooms. He sat by the windows and watched the city below. And sometimes, when the light was just right, he saw his reflection in the glass. It stared back at him. Silent. Unblinking. He had built the house to be transparent. To let the world see in. But the truth was, it had always been a mirror. And now, it showed him what he had become. On a cold morning in late autumn, Daniel stood at the edge of the property. The wind was sharp, cutting through his clothes. He looked out over the hills, the city in the distance. He thought about everything he had lost, everything he had destroyed, and everything he had saved. He turned back toward the house. The glass walls gleamed in the morning light, perfect and cold. And for the first time, He wondered if he should tear it all down. But he didn't. He walked inside, closed the door, and the house of glass stood, silent and empty, reflecting the world it kept out and the man it kept in.